Greetings, this is Greg. This is a Ford Mustang with the Ecoboost 4-cylinder turbo engine. At my shop, we have been doing a lot of testing and development on this car. Don't worry, we're still moving forward with Fiats and Alfa Romeos, new products for those cars, but I have more manpower now and we're expanding a bit. This particular car is lightly modified and I don't want to get the cart before the horse here, so let's start by looking at some stock dyno charts. There is a lot to unpack here. I'll start by saying that I'm using a Dim Sport all-wheel drive dyno. It's very advanced and has a lot of features I find useful. For one thing, the front rollers are hydraulically powered and have speed sensors on them so that the speed of the front wheels will exactly match the rears. I'm not saying that's required to dyno a Ford Mustang, but on some cars it is, so it's normally the way I do things. This chart shows the results for a totally stock 2018 Ecoboost Mustang in sport mode. There are two runs here. The blue lines are sport mode with a car that's cooled off. And in terms of temperature, when I say cooled off or heated up, I'm talking about the air temperature in the intake manifold, not coolant temperature or anything else. The red lines are for the exact same car, but for a run that was just moments after the run where we have the blue lines. And the lower numbers associated with the red lines are because the car is heated up. This car is very sensitive to temperature, which is something I'll talk about a lot in this video, as we will be looking at several results. I need to make sure you understand the chart. Of course, I'm trusting you can find horsepower and torque lines on your own. The horizontal red and blue lines near the top represent intake manifold pressure in pounds per square inch of boost. The scale for this is on the far left. It's a bit hard to read when you're looking at it like this. When it's on the dyno, it's super easy, as you'll see later. If you look closely, you will see that the blue line peaks at about 21 pounds of boost, and then the ECU starts to pull boost out at higher RPM, and it drops to about 12 psi from 21 by about 6,200 RPM. This is the car's normal behavior. Now, when the car heats up, the ECU starts pulling boost out around 5,000 RPM and it pulls out about 4 pounds of boost. I need to talk to you about the far left side of the chart for a moment, specifically the area below about 3,000 RPM. You'll notice that the red run has higher boost there, thus a bit more power and torque. That's entirely a function of Ford's less than perfect boost control. If you do this run 10 times, half the time the runs will look like the red one there, half the time they'll look like the blue run. It's really just luck of the draw, so don't read too much into that. Now the horizontal line at the bottom, those lines read in lambda instead of the more common air-fuel ratio numbers. This dyno is made for hardcore development work and most tuners think in terms of lambda. A lambda of 1 here means an air-fuel ratio of 14.7 to 1. 0.85 is about 12.5 to 1. Notice that this car goes very rich at high RPM. It goes to about 0.67 lambda, which is about 9.8 to 1 air-fuel ratio. That's very rich. It hurts power a bit, and that combined with the boost decreasing is why power declines so much after about 5,400 RPM. Now there are other factors contributing to that decrease in power as well, but right now we're talking about boost and mixture. It's worth noting that Ford is running the same mixture strategy with the car cool or hot. They protect the car when it gets hot in two ways, pulling out boost, which you just saw, and let's go to the next chart to see this. They also pull out ignition advance. There's a lot going on in this ECU. As RPM goes up, it's trying to maintain its power in spite of the decreased air density due to the high temps in the intake manifold. But after about 5,000 RPM, it goes into a full protection mode and starts pulling boost and timing out like crazy. It doesn't need to do anything here with mixture because its default is to run really rich up high anyway. Now let's go to Sport Plus mode. This gives us more power. From about 4,000 RPM on up, it's probably giving an extra 15 horsepower or so on average. At 6,200 RPM, it's giving around 30 more horsepower. Don't underestimate the significance of this. When going down the quarter mile, except of course at the start, The car's 10-speed automatic, with its fairly close gear ratios, keeps RPM in a narrow range up high. So average power going down the drag strip is significantly higher in Sport Plus versus plain Sport mode. This is also a big factor at a racetrack. The mode you run this car in matters. You want to run track mode at the track. We ran this car extensively in stock form at the drag strip and at Hallett Raceway, and I have to say that other than the heat soak problem, which was a big deal, the car did well at Hallett. A young lady who works for me was driving in these videos. I'm sorry about the low quality, but it's a cell phone video and I had to zoom it in because I was standing pretty far away from the action. Anyway, this was Dee's first time at a real racetrack, and the Mustang, or at least this version of it, is very predictable, and I felt good about putting her in the car. By the end of the day, she was turning in some very respectable lap times. Back to our chart. Why does Sport Plus put out more power than plain Sport mode? Two reasons. First, it consistently runs slightly more boost at the high end. I realize the boost lines mostly overlap here, but run after run, Sport Plus will run slightly more boost at the high end, about maybe 1 or 2 pounds more. Perhaps more significantly, Sport Plus runs more ignition advance. That's the real change between Sport and Sport Plus on the 2018 Ecoboost Mustang. This car has other performance modes as well, namely track and drag modes. However, the truth is that in terms of power, they are identical to Sport Plus. They vary in other ways, transmission behavior and such, but in terms of power, they are the same. They are correctly named, by the way. We've looked at this quite a bit, and you're best off using track mode at a racetrack, and you're best off using drag mode at the drag strip. Let's take a look at track mode lined up with Sport Plus. These two runs are really identical. Any variations you see here are just normal run-to-run variations with this car. It's impossible to get all the temperatures identical from one run to another. Intake air temp, coolant temp, oil temp, and so on. Plus, the car's boost control isn't rock solid, and it will vary slightly as well. Not to mention the fact that although the dyno manufacturers are loath to admit it, and the Dimsport dyno is one of the most accurate dynos, if not the most accurate chassis dyno. Nevertheless, all chassis dynos have some run-to-run variations as well, and it's typically 1 or 2%. That doesn't sound like much, but when you're testing, let's say, an air intake or an exhaust system that adds 5 horsepower to a 300 horsepower car, it takes a lot of runs to average everything out and see the gains. In fact, I'm absolutely convinced that some vendors simply use these run-to-run variations in their favor. In other words, you could have a product with no real gains, but show that 5 horsepower you wanted pretty easily, so buyer beware. Let's finish this up by overlaying, I should say, drag mode. Again, these are really the same. You're seeing a run-to-run variation. The drag mode has slightly more boost in this case, hence the extra 5 horsepower or so down low, but that's entirely a case of the car's less than perfect boost control. You might notice that I have some other runs there that I'm not covering. These were just done at higher temps, in other words, less cooldown time between them, and power suffered accordingly as they did in sport mode. I'm trying to show you runs that were done on a level playing field. So that's it for the stock runs. The car is now modified. So let's talk about those changes, and then I'll go over those dyno runs and you'll see them live, so to speak, on camera. We started our project here looking at this air intake, and I gotta say this air box here isn't bad. It's not amazing, but it's a pretty good air box, and it gets a very good supply of high pressure cold air. Now this is our intake tube from EC. It's not the factory one. So I have the factory one sitting over here. This is it, and there wasn't a whole lot to improve here. Frankly, the factory tube wasn't terrible either, but these corrugations, those are there primarily for speed on the assembly line. It helps them flex the thing into position and put the car together really fast, but they do disturb airflow a bit, so we went with a single smooth hump there on our product, which helps airflow a little bit, and we smoothed out the bends as best we could, but ultimately you got to get from the airbox to the turbo, and there's a certain amount of bending required. We tried to have very smooth transitions because it goes from being fairly big at that end to comparatively small at that end. So we did that. We made all the improvements we could to it, but again, with the factory intake, it's pretty good. Don't expect monstrous gains by changing that out. Also, I have the stock filter in the airbox here. You can put in a higher flow filter, a K&N or one of several types of brands, and I understand we're going to have our own high flow filter fairly soon to pair up with this intake tube. And while my intake tube is black to give it sort of a more or less stock appearance, be aware that we do have these in quite a few colors. We have gray, red, blue, and orange, as well as black, of course. And this is heavily reinforced. There are 4 or 5 layers of silicone here with Kevlar stitching in between. So it's a very, very strong product. Where Ford really let us down on this car is in intercooling. This is the intercooler out of this very car. It's 371 cubic inches as measured the following way: length times width times height of the core area alone, not including the end tanks. Now, using that same standard of measurement, this intercooler, which is out of my Fiat 124, is 394 cubic inches, again, versus 371. So the Fiat's intercooler is bigger than the Ford's, and you have to understand the difference in these cars, really understand what that means. That's my supercharged Alfa Romeo. Pay no attention to that. Okay, this is the Fiat we're talking about. This is a 1368cc engine, 160 horsepower stock. The Mustang here is a 2.3 liter engine, 310 horsepower stock, about 90 more, actually over 90% more stock horsepower than the Fiat, and yet the Mustang has a smaller intercooler. Now, the Fiat's intercooler is only just adequate for a Fiat 124 at stock power levels. The Mustang's intercooler is woefully inadequate, and we find that not only in dyno testing, but street driving, the drag strip. This intercooler is so poor that it's hard to get this car to the starting line at the drag strip without it already starting to heat soak just from creeping forward in the staging lanes, especially when it's a hot day. Also, at Hallett Raceway, and in this video you'll see some footage of our track session there, this car would heat soak even at high speeds before you get one whole lap done, and you'd feel the power going down lap after lap. So something really had to be done here. I'm not saying you can't soup up a Mustang with the stock intercooler, but you're really fighting an uphill battle if you do. So what we've done here at Eurocompulsion is we've swapped out this smaller factory intercooler for a big aftermarket intercooler. We went from 371 cubic inches to 1,044. Now, this exact intercooler is not the one we're going to be selling. The one we're going to be selling is almost identical in capacity and design. One difference, though, is this one is powder coated, and they even powder coated all of the fins. And while that looks nice, it reduces the efficiency of the intercooler. We need to talk about the design of this intercooler. It's a dual core design. You can see there's a thicker core at the bottom and a relatively thin core at the top. And what that enables you to do is get a lot of volume without using a really tall intercooler. That way it doesn't block too much, or affect, I should say, too much airflow to the air conditioning condenser. I live in Oklahoma. It gets pretty hot here, and there are many times I'm running the air conditioning on maximum in this car, so I don't want air conditioning that's less powerful. This has a negligible effect on the air conditioning, as opposed to a type that maybe has the same volume, but instead of the thick core down low, they just make the whole thing taller, and that will negatively affect the air conditioning. The thick part of this core is actually below the air conditioning condenser, so that portion of this intercooler doesn't affect it at all. So, of course, you know, there are pros and cons to everything. There's no best possible answer here with intercooling. For me personally, this is the best answer, because to me this is a street car and I want the air conditioning to work really well. However, for some of you, you might be better off with a taller intercooler without this dual core type setup. The drawback to this is that the cooling air, which is passing through the intercooler this way, going through the fins, that cools down the charge air, that's the air coming from the turbo that then travels through the intercooler core and gets cooled off. The cooling air has to travel farther through this section of the intercooler, and as it does that, as it goes back on this intercooler, it heats up more and more. And as it heats up, it's less effective at cooling the charge air than let's say the charge air going through here, because it doesn't have as much chance to heat up. So as a general rule, a tall, thin core is what you want for a given amount of core volume. Now, don't get me wrong, this thing is super effective. I really can't see this being a problem with any reasonable street EcoBoost Mustang power level. So I'm very happy with this intercooler. We will soon have these up for sale, although with some slight changes. Primarily ours is not going to be powder coated because I think that's stupid. Also, this intercooler is quite economical, and we will have an upgraded version of this, and I'm not sure I'm at liberty to talk about that yet. But anyway, we'll have this version, which is a low-cost version, and then we'll have a more expensive upgraded version. And this connects to the factory intercooling plumbing. So this is the factory plumbing right here. I don't know if you can see it there. Yeah, right here. And then that's the throttle body, of course. So it's nice that it connects to the factory plumbing, although we are going to offer our own plumbing optionally, which will have fittings for various useful things: temperature sensors, nitrous system, water injection, whatever. I'm pretty big on water injection. I should mention this is the EcoBoost Performance Package Mustang. See, we've got the big brakes. Now, this car is a 2018, and in that year, the Performance Package Mustang did not have one extra horsepower over the standard EcoBoost. They're 310. But what this does get us is these really cool wheels, which I really like. Having some disagreements with the kids about that, but I like these wheels. And most importantly, it gives us a 355 limited slip ring and pinion gear. Now, these tires, I'll show you what they are here, unfortunately are hard as a rock. We took this car to the drag strip when it was dead stock, and we took it, I think we went in June, it might have even been July, and it was really hot at the drag strip. We could not get this car out of the 14s, and I know that stock these things will solidly run in the 13s, especially with that 355 ring and pinion, but this car wasn't having it. We couldn't get better than about a 2.2 60 foot with these tires, and the car would start to heat soak pretty badly at about the 8th mile, and power would start dropping off, and we just couldn't get this thing out of the 14s. Now, I have no doubt that this car would be in the high 13s with good tires and under more favorable atmospheric conditions, and I'm hoping it's a good bit faster than that now, but we'll find out. Anyhow, the other mod, so this has basically 4 mods. It has an EC tune on it, which Toby made, my son-in-law, and he does almost all the tuning stuff at Eurocompulsion. He does a really good job. It has the intake I described, although with the stock filter. Realistically, that's not adding any measurable amount of horsepower, but I just really like it. I like the way it looks. And we've got the Ragazon exhaust, which gives it kind of a throaty sound. It's fairly quiet. It's catback only. This car has its stock catalytic converter. It has its stock, all of its stock emission controls. And this exhaust is fairly quiet when you're going down the road, but when you get on it, you can definitely hear it. And I'm a big fan of Ragazon exhaust anyway, so that's what I used here. Now we'll do a dyno run. That's my son-in-law Toby driving the car. He's a real subject matter expert on ECU tuning, and he did make the tune that's on this car. He does the dyno run, at least this time he did, in 6th gear. I normally use 7th. Different people at my shop seem to have different preferences on how to do things, but 6 in one, half dozen in the other. It makes almost no difference between 6th and 7th gear. I'm going to make it a point to show the dyno screen during the dyno run. We're not going to film the car and then cut to a dyno chart. I've always felt that's a little bit shady. So you can see the screen as the car revs up and is putting down some power. The lines on the graph don't mean anything yet. The dyno software redraws them when the run is complete. And it doesn't consider the run to be complete until we've coasted all the way back down to the start point. Start point in this case was 2,250 RPM. Notice that it's almost 84 degrees in my shop too. We were doing this on a fairly warm day. You might want to keep that in mind for comparative purposes anyway. So 292 wheel horsepower. The vertical line shows where that 292 horsepower occurred and what the other parameters were there. 91 miles per hour, for example, 5436 RPM, and so forth. Now, I just asked Alexander to scroll that vertical line over to the left. That makes it really easy on this dyno to see exactly what things are in different spots. So 366, 367 pound-feet of torque at 2670 something RPM. This next test is going to measure power and torque versus speed as opposed to engine RPM. We're going to measure this from about 60 to 115 miles per hour because that's the range in the quarter mile at which the Mustang will absolutely not be traction limited. So it's pretty meaningful when you're trying to figure out the car's performance. It also means the car is going to have to shift gears on the dyno, which is not at all a problem on this particular dyno. I'm not sure what gear Toby is starting in, probably 4th or 5th, and I'm guessing it's going to end in 7th, but I'm not really sure about that. On this dyno run, it's still pretty warm in the shop. You can see 83.6 degrees. That 82 degrees is for the oil temperature probe, but we don't have that probe installed for this particular test. It's something we use sometimes, but we're not using it today, so that number doesn't mean anything. Now during the test, again, these numbers don't mean anything on the way up, and you can see how fast Toby's going. He's going to get right to about 115 miles an hour, and then, looks like he went slightly faster, and then let off on the throttle. And now the car is coasting down, and you can hear some burbling sounds. They're somewhat subdued because I have the video volume turned way down so you can hear me talk, but they're very noticeable when you're on the road. He can make those louder or more quiet depending on what you want. Also, I should say that's an option on the tune, that burbling sound. It's a pretty popular option with our other cars. In the case of this car, it's only going to be in the higher mode, so you can still drive around in normal mode like a normal quiet neighbor. I want to talk about a few things here on this chart. First of all, the torque multiplication. No, the engine isn't capable of generating 800 pound-feet of torque, but with the torque multiplication of the gear ratios and the rear axle ratio, it certainly is capable of doing that in lower gears. And that's something that a lot of people don't understand. When you have a normal dyno run, it may show torque at the wheels, but what it's really showing is that, not counting the gear multiplication, because they're trying to really show what your engine is doing. This particular test takes the gear multiplication into account, and so you can see how much torque you're actually putting to the road, and you can see the decrease as the car shifts gears. And when you're planning things like shift points or gear ratios for future upgrades, this is particularly helpful. Now, perhaps more important is the amount of power through this range. And remember, the test was from 60 to 115 miles per hour. The graph goes a little bit either side of that, but that's where we were doing the test. And in that entire range, this car has more power at the wheels than the stock car ever has. That's a big deal. Furthermore, the power doesn't drop off as the car goes through the run like it typically will with a stock configuration, and that has a lot to do with the intercooler helping to keep things cool. And of course, on a real road, this would be even better because we'd have 100 miles an hour or more of airflow. Of these various mods we've done to the car, which are intake, intercooler, exhaust, and tune, the tune is doing the heavy lifting here. That's providing us the biggest gains of power. And there are various options with that tune. You can have the burbles when you back off of the throttle, which we talked about earlier. Trans brake is an option for certain software variations. It can't be done on every EcoBoost Mustang. There are other options as well. You'll have to check the Eurocompulsion site to see that. Now, of these other mods, the intake doesn't do a whole lot. We just couldn't make it flow a lot better than the stock tube. It does flow a little bit better. Dee's working the camera. Can you hand me that intake? And I'll talk about that a little bit more. The exhaust is great. I love the Ragazon exhaust. It's made from, thank you, Dee. It's made from 304 stainless steel. It flows well. It sounds good. It's going to last forever. I really like the Ragazon exhaust. And it also doesn't break the bank, at least by Italian exhaust standards. Now, this intake In addition to flowing slightly better than the stock tube, it insulates from heat a little bit better. The silicone rejects heat very well, and it's fairly thick. And it's going to be a whole lot better at rejecting heat than a metal tube. Even a stainless steel tube that's ceramic coated will not reject heat as well as a good silicone intake. So this is a good product. Obviously this one's orange. I don't know how well that particular color is going to sell, but we have other colors as well. The intercooler is well worth getting, not so much because it increases power, although it does a little bit, but because it prevents the power from dropping off when you're on the power for a long period of time, because the intercooler just doesn't heat soak, the upgraded one, the way the stock one does. The stock intercooler is a bit of a mess in that regard. And I think that Ford did that on purpose, partially because they didn't want people to be able to tune these cars really easily and get them to be competitive with the GT. See, one thing that I know a lot of viewers are going to talk about is they're going to say, well, you should have got a Mustang GT, you should have got the V8. I get that, but you need to keep in mind that this car is $8,000 to $10,000 less than a comparably equipped V8 model. Even more, there's even a greater price disparity on the used market. Also, this car uses less fuel, it's less money to insure by quite a bit, and it's easier to work on. So there are a lot of advantages to this, and with the performance package, which this car has, it's very competitive with a GT around a racetrack. Maybe not in a straight-up drag race, but around a racetrack. So I think Ford was very interested in making sure it wasn't going to be super easy for the aftermarket to get this car up to GT levels of performance in the quarter mile. And one of the ways they hamstrung it is with that tiny intercooler. And then they protected themselves with the excessively rich mixture at the high end. So a lot can be done with this car with tuning and better intercooling. Now, the last thing I want to talk about are a couple other YouTube channels. And those of you that have watched this channel for a while know that about the only time I'm ever on camera is when I'm talking about other YouTube channels, because that's something that I'm just not going to do from the other side of the camera anonymously, so to speak. And in this case, I'm saying some really positive things about these other channels. And they are David Vizard's channel and Andy Wood's channel, which is Unity Motorsports Garage. David Vizard, and he's working with Andy Wood, Andy is helping him, are doing a series on hopping up these EcoBoost Mustangs. Now, David Vizard has been around forever. The first book I read from him was in 1990, and it was just amazing. I learned a lot from that book, and I've read several of his books since. I've watched his videos. He's one of the top engine guys in the world. And not only engines, but everything. Suspension, brakes. He's a very successful race driver and hot rodder. And when somebody like that is making a video series on a car you're interested in, you should probably watch it. So I'm highly suggesting that any of you that are interested in these EcoBoost Mustangs, check out David Vizard's channel and just search in the YouTube bar for David Vizard Mustang, and I'm sure it'll come up. I'll also have a link in the description. Now, as for his comrade in this endeavor, so to speak, Andy of Unity Motorsports Garage, his channel also has a little bit of the EcoBoost Mustang stuff on it, but it has a fantastic number of videos that primarily deal with older American car V8s. Like, for example, one of my favorite V8s, which I've never owned, maybe if I owned one it wouldn't be my favorite, but I really like the 351 Cleveland. And Andy has some fantastic videos at Unity Motorsports Garage on the Cleveland engine. He also has a really wild pickup truck that is definitely worth checking out. So links for those two channels are in the description. And if you're interested in these cars, these EcoBoost Mustangs, I think they're well worth watching. And one more thing I want to mention about the EcoBoost Mustang is that, yes, people tend to compare it to the V8 car, but when you consider the price difference, I think that this is really in a different category. And I think that if the automotive journalists compared this car to Subaru WRXs or Toyota FRSs, or the Subaru version of that, whatever we're calling those things, Toyobarus, or Volkswagen turbo 4-cylinders, then they would be, if this car said Volkswagen on it and had the performance of a 4-cylinder turbo Golf, the automotive journalists would be raving about this thing. But it sort of exists in the shadow of the GT, and I get that. But I think that people should realize what a really good performance bargain this is. That's all I have for now, so thanks very much for watching. I know it's been a long video. Goodbye and have a great day.